Live. I like to say that. Anyway, this is going to be an unedited video. I'm just going to try to go with out the guff, all natural, and just say what my weird mouth tends to say when I'm trying to do these comparisons. But first of all, if you're new to my channel, definitely consider subscribing. I talk about cameras in terms for video, so hit that subscribe button if you like to see these camera tests and new camera stuff. Anyway, I'm holding up this piece of paper right here. The point of this piece of paper is to measure detail on a camera. Now I'm recording off of the Canon R5, and in this comparison, I wanted to check two modes on the R5 to see if it even makes sense to use one over the other when recording a video. Now, what mode is it? I'm going to record 4K in standard mode, which everyone has said don't ever do it. It's basically a waste of a codec. If you want 4K, you do 4K HQ, which is oversampled from 8K. So what about 1080p? Obviously, I edited there. So 1080p in itself is obviously less resolution than 4K, but is it truly less detail? Now, depending on what ISO you're using, your results may vary. But I'm going to do it off of this well-lit scenario. I've got ISO set at 400 in my studio. So what we're going to see is if you actually do get similar or more quality if you record 4K standard versus 1080p. Now, here we go. 4K standard, that's what I'm recording now, and I'm going to hold this chart at a specific distance. I've got the floor marked so that when I hold it here to basically my face. So this is 4K standard. Now we're going to switch to 1080p. Here we go. Now recording in 1080p. Same frame rate. Same shot. Everything. It's full screen. And I'll hold it up like this. 4K 60. See if you can pick up the same amount of detail. And the other difference with 4K 60 is the fact that you have to use a higher shutter speed, which means, you know, I needed to brighten up the ISO, which could affect the overall image. And then when I go to 4K 120, that'll definitely affect the overall image. But look at the detail here that you get 4K 120. Is it the same as 1080p? And if that's the case, if we record 1080 in 120 frames per second when that update comes out, will it be good enough? In any case, I'm going to stop recording and then we're going to go right to the computer right now and check out the results. Here we go. So in this computer shot, what you can see right here is this is a really zoomed in shot of 4K standard. It's zoomed to 784%, basically because I wanted to get the middle. Because if you look at these lines, like what I've got on the screen, as they go towards the middle, they kind of like tend to fade away in the detail. And if you look right towards the middle right over there, you'll see that it loses detail. So the closer you get to the middle, I guess the more detail that your camera can resolve. Now, I didn't test 8K. I only tested the modes that I felt I wanted to see a difference to, because 4K HQ is going to be higher detail than 4K standard. 8K is going to be higher detail than standard. That we already know. Cropped 4K is going to be more detailed than 4K standard. But I wanted to know is there a difference between the faster frame rates in 4K and the standard 4K with 1080p? I mean, if you're filming in 1080p, is there a difference? So here, again, to the point, here's the first shot. This is 4K standard. Now, let's compare that to a really zoomed in 1080p. This is 1080p. And I'm not sure if you too can pick up what I see right here, but I see that the compression and the detail is pretty much vastly different. You get a lot more detail in 4K standard than you do in 1080p. So that's good news. That means if you're recording in 4K standard and you're like, am I wasting space here? Should I be recording in 1080p? No, with 4K standard, you do get more detail than you would with 1080p. But is there a big difference between, say, 4K 60 and 1080p? Because that higher frame rate, and it has to resolve that entire sensor faster, is that like line skippy mode Are you going to get more detail, or will it be comparable to, let's say, 1080p footage? So this is 1080p. This is 4K 60. 1080p, 4K 60. And just for comparison, 4K 60, 4K standard. So 4K standard is pretty close to detail when it comes to 4K 60. They're almost identical. There seems to be almost be a little bit more. That could be an exposure difference, but there almost seems to be a little bit more detail in 4K standard than 4K 60. Is that a good thing? I don't know. Probably not. Let's go one step further. 4K 120 versus 1080p. So this is 1080p. This is 4K 120. 1080p, 4K 120. So there is a bit more detail in 4K 120. Let's compare 4K 120 to 4K 60. Pretty close. 4K 60, 4K 120. It's a little bit softer in 4K 120 from what I can tell. So this is 4K 60, 4K 120. Now let's look at 4K 120 versus a 1080p. 4K 120, 1080p, which 1080p is a lot less detail. And now this is 4K standard, and this is 4K 120. Standard, 4K 120. Standard, 4K 120. The slightest bit more detail in standard than 4K 120. So 4K standard, in my opinion, still kind of overdoes it. Now this is 4K 60 again compared to 4K standard. It really is not as bad as 1080p. Like this is 1080p. You are going to get more detail filming in 4K standard. 4K 60, 4K 120 are more closer to 4K standard, but even 4K standard might be just a hair, just the slightest hair, based off of what I could see, better than those higher frame rate modes. But they're still all excellent. And this is like really zoomed in. Now I'm going to take these shots and I'm going to zoom out by just kind of deleting all the shots in my timeline. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put all the shots on this timeline, and I'm going to ask you guys, or I'll show it to you guys and see, can you tell the difference between what was faster frame rate and what wasn't? Here we go. Look at my screen now. This is one shot. This is another shot. This is another shot. Granted, it's like between frames there, so it's probably blurry, but there's another shot. And there's another shot. Of all these shots, alright, let's do one more time. Of all these shots, is there really a big difference? Alright, now let's get to the spoilers to see which shot was which. This first shot that you see here is 4K 60. This next shot is 4K 120. This shot is 4K standard. And finally, this is 1080p. Like, really hard to tell. You'd have to really look to the details. But they're so close, you can hardly tell. And that's the point and magic of all of this. Is it's really, you're not going to get really bad looking footage with anything you film on the R5, whether it's 1080p or 4K. But if you want that slight bit of detail and you don't want overheating, I'd still recommend 4K crop if you don't want to worry about overheating, because 4K crop up to 30 frames per second does not overheat and is an oversampled 5K footage downsampled to 4K, so that's awesome. But you can also get faster frame rates and do everything that you need to do, but you don't have to really worry about sacrificing too much quality if you're pushing it, or if you really want a high resolution image, because this camera does pretty well even if it's lower resolution. And 4K HQ standard, I actually was thinking that it was going to be close to 1080p or practically the same thing. It's darn close, but still better than 1080p. So I'm surprised. I'm pleasantly surprised. That means I can still use 4K standard and feel like I'm getting a little bit more detail than 1080p footage. So that's good. But what do you guys think of this test? Did I test it the wrong way? Again, I wasn't going too scientific with this. I just wanted to see with my own eyes whether that would please me or not. Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you, and as always, you'll make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. See you guys later.